Hello everyone, my name is Izzy and welcome to Clear IT. Today we're going to talk about the CPU, the Central Processing Unit. In the last video we mentioned that this is like the brain of the computer, right? It's, we talked about the CPU, the RAM, everything has its own function. Well, now we're going to talk in depth about the CPU, go into detail so that you can understand what you're looking for when you make a decision on a CPU. So let's go. Okay, the first thing we need to discuss is, well, who makes CPUs? And there are a number of companies, but when it comes to desktops and laptops, there are two players. Player number one, Intel, and number two is AMD. Now, I say number one is Intel because they are by far the bigger company. They hold much larger percentage of the market share. And really up until very recently, they were the go-to for anyone who was looking for, the better performance. They were considered the ones that had the better product. Now, I don't know if that's true today. We'll talk about that shortly. But definitely, they are the long-standing champions. And when it comes to the business world, the gaming world, for a very, very long time, they dominated. Things are changing a little bit now, as we're going to discuss. Okay, so we have Intel making CPUs and we have AMD making CPUs. Let's talk a little bit more about the kind of CPUs they make and the variations that are out there so that you can go ahead and get the right one, the one that you need. Okay, well, the first thing we need to understand is the family, the CPU family. Okay, so there's a number of series that they make. Intel has, the Pentium, they have the Atom, the Celeron, a number of other lower powered, lower performance, cheaper CPUs. They have higher end Xeon, which we usually find in servers. Same thing with AMD. For the most part, as an IT professional, I would never recommend the lower end. Even if you're just a basic user, I don't recommend the lower end CPUs ever for anybody. So if you're on a tight budget and for whatever the reason, this is what you can afford, go right ahead, get what you need, and that's that. But assuming you have a little bit of flexibility and you want to make a decision, get the right product. If you're looking for a desktop or a laptop, what you want is as follows. For the CPU, if you're going Intel, you want to get what we call the one of the processors in the I series. Okay, so one of the I series processors. Okay, they have four. They have i3, i5, i7, i9. Okay, i3 being the least powerful, i9 being the most powerful. And then they make the Xeon, but that's usually found in servers or really high-end workstations. Okay, on the AMD side of things, for a long time they had a different naming convention. They had, the A series and other things. Recently, not that recent, it's a couple of years already. They have the Ryzen series. This is what we should be keeping our eye on. Okay, and similar to Intel, they kind of kept the name similar with the Ryzen 3, 5, 7, and 9. Okay, now these are kind of general, families of CPUs, and there are better and worse ones. Okay, the i3 you could consider, the basic. That would be the basic CPU. It'll work, it'll get the job done, but if you need any kind of extra, any kind of better performance, you're not going to necessarily, it may not cut it, that i3 or the Ryzen 3. i5, that's kind of like the mainstream in the business world. This is almost exclusively what we see, unless, someone's, a little bit on a tighter budget or for whatever reason has a need for a higher end CPU, we're going to see the i5. That's by far their most popular model. It's their mid-range CPU, does a fantastic job as a general purpose CPU for almost all applications. i7, that's high end, that's higher end, that's for someone who's, requires more performance than the average person. And finally, i9 or Ryzen 9 is already performance. So what do we need? So for most people, again, if we take, I'm sorry, AMD fans, I'm not going against AMD, but we definitely deal a lot more with Intel. So I'm just going to focus on that, for the sake of the comparison. Okay, i5 is our mid-range kind of general purpose CPU. Again, for more of a simple basic user, someone who's not doing that much, i3 is fine. Now don't forget, most people are running Windows 10. Windows 10 is a pretty heavy operating system, which means just to run it, just for it to function properly and to do what you need to do, you gotta have a good brain, you gotta have a good CPU, and the i3 is I would go no less than that. Okay, i5 again mid-range. i7, somebody who's doing CPU intensive tasks. It could be somebody who may be doing a little bit of video, some light video editing, maybe a gamer. These are processes that are hard on the CPU that require a better CPU. Maybe somebody who deals with a lot of, very large Excel spreadsheets with pivot tables and all kinds of things. QuickBooks could be a little heavy. You don't need an i7 for QuickBooks. i5 is fine. But again, if someone's using multiple applications, multiple programs, at some point it's going to catch up with you if, that higher end CPU would be the i7. Recently they came out, with their latest series, with their latest CPU, that was i9. Not that the i7 is older. We'll talk about generations soon. But i9 is something that hasn't been around for a long time. It's kind of the newest member of the family, and that's, kind of for that high-end extreme performance, much more powerful than the others. And you're only gonna find that, with, heavy gamers, someone who does, major video editing, video rendering, things like that. Otherwise, it's overkill for almost everybody. Okay, Ryzen kind of, the AMD Ryzens are kind of doing something similar to that. They're 3, 5, 7, and 9. I would categorize them the same way. For a long time, their performance lagged. Intel was almost always the winner. You had an Intel versus Ryzen. The Intel outperformed. Lately, that is not true. Ryzen is doing a really good job. They're coming back strong. We're still not seeing it in the business world yet. They're usually, a little slower, a little less open-minded, I would say, when it comes to changes. And, we've always been using Intel. It's the better processor, end of story. We'll see. We'll see how things shift. But for now, that's definitely true. That's definitely the case. In the business world, it's still all Intel. A lot of enthusiasts, a lot of gamers, they're excited about the Ryzens. They're using them. You could really go either one. The Ryzens also, because they were, they didn't perform as well, were cheaper. With better performance also came, the price went up a little bit. So really at this point, if you don't have a specific reason why you need one or the other, I would say you could really go either or. Okay, that's kind of an overview of the desktop family of CPUs that they make. Okay, now let's go ahead. Let's talk about features, a little bit more of the specific features that we're looking for in our CPU so that we can make the right choice. I have people ask me, what's the difference between the $150 computer and the $900 computer? They both say Intel on them. Well, right, there might be a couple other factors we need to take into account. And the most expensive part, or usually the most expensive part, is the CPU. So, let's get that right. Let's make smart decisions when we choose our CPU. Okay, so let's talk about some specs. The most important spec probably is gigahertz. When I say most important, it's because, that's kind of the main way of measuring a CPU is in gigahertz. Now, it doesn't mean it will perform the best if it has more gigahertz. Definitely not. But every CPU is measured in gigahertz. Okay, so gigahertz is the speed, how many millions or billions of processes can be calculated per second. And they kind of max out, if you want to know, like the top performance. We're seeing now around, in the fives. 5 gigahertz, a little under 5 gigahertz, a little over. A couple of years ago, we didn't see 5 gigahertz. We saw 4 gigahertz. I don't think you'll see anything under 1 or even, close to 2 gigahertz, high ones, 1.8, 1.9, things like that. So I would say the normal range is probably between 2 to 4 gigahertz. We have performance, bursting to, even 5 gigahertz. But more gigahertz means, in the purest form, more calculations per second. Okay, again, that doesn't necessarily translate into real-world performance, though. Next thing to know about is cores. Okay, so you could consider a core like a brain. Okay, CPUs today have more than one core. Let's say they have 2 cores. So if your CPU has 2 cores, it's kind of like it has 2 brains, and maybe it could do 2 things at once, 2 calculations at once. Okay, so the more cores doesn't mean you'll get better performance on a single task, but you may be able to have multiple tasks performing at the same speed that previously only one task could perform at. That's cores. Also, there could be some applications written to be able to utilize multiple cores. So again, that'll translate to better performance. Today, everything has at least 2 cores. We have higher end CPUs with 4 cores, 6 cores, even 8 cores. In the server world, it goes way beyond that. You could have 16 cores, 24 cores, and so on. We don't see that in the desktop, though. Okay, so that's the next thing that you need to take into account. How many cores does your CPU have? The more cores, the more do you need it? That kind of depends what you're doing. But again, 2 cores is considered basic, 4 very good. Anything after that is already, it's going to be your i7, your i9, higher end CPUs. Okay, then comes threads. The next thing is threads. So a single CPU can handle multiple processes at once, and that is designed by threads. So you might have 2 core but 4 threads. CPU might have 2 cores but 4 threads, which means that it could do multiple tasks. Now, 2 threads will not perform as well as 2 cores will perform, 2 physical cores, 2 brains. But you can consider it like a single brain that can do 2 tasks. Okay, and again, most CPUs today can handle more than 1 task. They've figured out how to do that. So multiple threads will enhance the performance of a single core. So again, you might have, best example probably, 2 cores, 4 threads. We'll take a look soon at some CPUs, and we'll see how that looks. Another feature often overlooked is the cache. So the cache is a little bit of storage, in the megabyte, so it's not a lot at all. And the cache kind of stores a little bit of information to be available when the CPU needs it. CPUs are very, very fast. They're much faster than the other components on the motherboard. They're faster than the RAM. They're way faster than the hard drive. And just about everything else that's sending it data to process. Okay, so it has a little cache where it can store some data that it may need quick access to later. The bigger the cache, the better performance you should see. But again, that cache is small. That cache is megabytes, not gigabytes or anything like that. Okay, next. Laptop versus desktop. It's important to point out also, a question that I get a lot. Will I be better off with a desktop? Will I have better performance with a desktop? And the answer, of course, like everything, is it depends. Depends what you're doing. But in our CPU conversation, desktop CPUs are generally more powerful than laptop CPUs. Laptop CPUs, on the other hand, use less power. Think about that. Your laptop is running on a battery, right? Power consumption is a big deal. Low power means longer battery life, which is a big deal. But it comes at the cost of performance. So typically, we'll find a laptop, even if they're both an i5, but the laptop will have a laptop CPU, where the desktop might have a desktop CPU, and the laptop CPU will not be able to perform as well as the desktop CPU. Now, it might be okay for you, might be fine, might get the job done, but it's something to think about. Additionally, a lot of times we find very, very small desktops, like micro desktops or all-in-one desktops. A lot of times they'll throw a laptop CPU in there. So people are often say, what do I need a tower for? It wastes space. What do I need? It's ugly. Nowadays everything's tiny, laptops, portable. That's true, and that's good, and for most people it's fine. But if performance is a big deal to you, you should just keep in mind that the desktop i5, that laptop i5, even though, on that quick description they might seem the same, they very well may not be. Socket. When choosing a CPU, again, if you're going to buy a computer, it's ready-made, it's fine, it's pre-built, then this is not a conversation. But if you are building your own computer, just make sure you get a compatible motherboard, because the CPU has to fit in the socket. Now, AMD and Intel, they make their sockets reverse from each other. One has holes in the socket in the motherboard, and the CPU fits in the holes. This kind of, the little metal receptors are coming out of the CPU going into the motherboard, and then the other has the reverse, where the CPU itself has the holes and it fits into the motherboard. So again, AMD motherboards and Intel motherboards, they don't mix. If you got an Intel CPU, you got to get an Intel motherboard, and vice versa. But also there's different socket sizes, so you got to make sure. For example, a popular socket is the LGA 1151 for Intel. Well, if your CPU only fits in an LGA 1152 and you got a motherboard with an LGA 1151, it's not going to fit. So make sure you get the right one, where the pins, the right number of pins for the right socket. Otherwise, it's just not going to go in. And of course, that's not going to be too good for you. A couple of more features I just want to point out. These are features that are, help with performance. Number one is hyperthreading. This is something, this is an Intel thing. They call it hyperthreading. Although, of course, AMD has something similar. And hyperthreading is a technology that allows you to get more processes out of your threads. So again, we talked about the physical cores, we talked about multiple threads in a core, but then hyperthreading is like the next level, the next step, where you could do even more processes can run simultaneously, even more handles could be running within a specific thread. Okay, so if a CPU has hyperthreading, that's a good thing. That means you'll get better performance. Same thing goes with turbo boost for Intel, or precision boost for AMD. This is important. We talked about gigahertz before in the beginning, and we talked about reaching higher speeds, reaching 5 gigahertz. Well, these are not the base speeds. The base speeds are usually much lower, but they can burst short term. They can burst short term and get better, faster speeds, to pick up performance for a limited amount of time. And that's called turbo boost or precision boost. So again, Intel, AMD, they've come up with ways where even if you have a CPU that's base speed is 2.4 gigahertz, for example, maybe it can burst to 3.9, and you can really get a lot better performance for those times when you need. Okay, the last important thing I want to tell you, and again, I'm not getting into all the nitty-gritties of CPUs. There's a lot, if you want to understand on a deeper level how the CPU works, there's a lot of stuff out there. This is just what you need to look for to make sure you get the right thing, and that's graphics. Is the last point. So the graphics come from when Intel, they make what we call integrated graphics. Integrated graphics means that the CPU, besides for doing general computing processes, can also handle graphics, which means if you have an Intel CPU, you don't need a graphics card in your computer. It'll work. You'll be able to see the screen. You'll be able to hook up a couple of monitors to it, and it'll work fine. Again, you need better performance. You want the next level, you get a graphics card. But Intel has integrated graphics in all their CPUs. AMD doesn't. With AMD, you need to have dedicated graphics. CPU does not handle the graphics. Of course, they do make one that does, Sometimes they might call that an APU. Their APU is kind of their two-in-one. Okay, so most AMD CPUs don't have graphics built in. They do make some that do have Radeon graphics built in, but of course that comes usually at the cost of performance on the CPU. Okay, those are the main specs that we look for when it comes to our CPUs. Again, gigahertz, cores, threads, that cache. Is it a desktop or is it a laptop CPU? If you're building a machine yourself, make sure you get the right motherboard with the right socket. We have some additional features like hyperthreading, turbo boosting, the graphics that's built in, and these are the main things we look for when it comes to shopping for a CPU. Let's jump over. Let's have a look at a computer, and let's see what it looks like. I'm gonna jump over to bnh.com. Actually, look for a CPU. Okay. And we can see here, key features, 12 cores. Okay, this is their 9. It's got 12 cores, 4.6 gigahertz max boost clock. Okay, we talked about that turbo boost or the max boost or whatever you may want to call it. 3.8 gigahertz base clock, which is very fast. And finally, the socket. So with the Ryzens, they're all AM4. They made it easier for us. The AM4 socket, that is a fit for all Ryzens for the time being. Let's have a look at an Intel CPU. And we can see here, key features, 6 cores, 6 threads. Again, this is an i5. We got our clock speed, our socket type, our max turbo. If you want to go into some greater detail, here we can see the exact model, which we'll talk about shortly. Socket type, number of cores, number of threads, base clock speed, maximum boost speed. Here's our cache, and then some other things, how much memory it can support, how much RAM it can support, power consumption, other things. Here's the integrated graphics we talked about, Ultra HD graphics 630, how many displays it can support, jumping back to an AMD for a second. Here, let's have a look at the specs. And again, we can see cores, threads, base clock speed, max boost, cache, the max memory speeds it can support, power consumption, graphics, none. This is that precision boost we talked about, and so on. So these are the main things we're looking for when we're shopping for CPU. Thanks for watching, guys. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video. And of course, don't forget to comment. Ask questions, share your experiences, and I'll see you in the next video.